So we talked about your baptism. Did I record? Yeah, it's recording. We talked about your baptism of fire, your combat performance, and how the 506th was such a peak unit. Do you want to talk about your relations with fellow allies, the various countries?
Never had any relationship with anybody that I can remember.
Okay.
None. Other than the British, and that was about it.
And what'd you think of the British?
Well, I was, pleased with all the people in Britain that I had ever met and their attitude and the way they were putting up with the terrible life they were leading. But being in combat with the British, their way of performing, other than the way Americans perform, was of a complete opposite way of doing things. Most of the men from sergeant down would not do anything unless they had permission from their commander. We had instances where we wanted them to fire on a German tank, and they wouldn't fire unless they had permission from their commander, and it ended up their tank was destroyed. I was on a mission one day to take a small town in Holland, and we had worked our way close, safely and cautiously into the town, and it got to be 5, 6 o'clock in the evening or the afternoon, and they said, well, that's it for today. We'll back up and we'll come back again tomorrow. That is not the American way, and I honestly feel that one of the reasons, not completely the reason, there was many reasons why the Market Garden was not a success, but the British, in my opinion, didn't help make it a success. I think if General Patton had been involved, it would have been completely different.
You didn't work with any of the... Do you ever work with the Free French or any of the resistance groups?
No, I've never met or worked with any people other than pretty much our own people. And we had some people in Holland that were trying to help, and I just felt that they were more in the way than they were a help. Mm-hmm. They thought they were doing what we needed and wanted. In many cases, let us do it. Let us do it.
Okay. Now, when you're back from the front lines and in the reserves, what was a typical day like?
Well, it was hard to explain a typical day after we were behind the lines. And you're talking about, this is behind the lines when we were just going for a rest period.
Rest periods pulled
right.
from the lines?
Right. Well, we're not completely out of combat way. You're talking the combat zones?
No, I'm talking...
Or just completely relieved from any combat?
Yeah, let's go with that. We'll start there.
Well, the way I remember it is the fact that, if we were not in any combat of any sort, it was, like a day in the park. Mm-hmm. You did whatever the battalion or company commander or the sergeant wanted you to do. There were usually passes where you could go to town, and sometimes there would be weekend passes. And it was, a very comfortable life when this took place. But other than that, when we were in combat and you had a day off or whatever, where you were drawn behind the lines, where you wouldn't go to be on the line with your gun ready to go, it was a day of reflection, a day of trying to get something more food in your system, and just trying to acclimate yourself to bigger and better days, and you reflect back to when this war is over, what will I do and how will I do it.
Was there a lot of anxiety for the next jump?
Well, there was quite a bit of anxiety. We had we had several jumps that were cut off before we went into Market Garden, mm-hmm. And I don't think there was any desperate or worrisome apprehension. We usually were well briefed as to where we were going to be and what the mission would be. And this was part of our life. And here we had trained so many years for the invasion of Normandy, and that was 33 days of action in Normandy. And we felt that we hadn't been really used completely or properly. You know, we thought we'd be in action or be in combat longer than what the Normandy turned out to be. But Normandy, they said it would only be maybe 3 days or maybe a week, and of course it turned into 33 days. But in my opinion, I think the time went rather fast while we were in Normandy.
Now, how would you rather have seen the airborne employed? I mean, the 3 days of fighting be pulled back, refitted quickly, and then dropped again, or?
Well, my thinking back to when I was just going to volunteer to be airborne, my thoughts back then, it would be a very small group, maybe a dozen men. They would drop in, blow up a bridge, bring back a prisoner, or do something of that sort. Like a commando group of that sort.
Okay.
I never dreamed in my mind that this was an invasion of the infantry without any jeeps or any transportation. This was something I had never even anticipated or thought about, that we were going to be commandos and not just regular infantry. That's what we turned out to be.
Now, how did you and your comrades regard enemy troops? What did you think of their fighting ability?
Well, we thought the Germans were, you know, real tough and eager and ambitious fighting unit. But we did discover, and I think you'll find this is an opinion for many men that have been in combat and faced it all, that if they lost their officer or their command that was part of that unit, they didn't think on their feet like an American soldier would. The American soldier had been trained and was able and capable of thinking on his feet and doing what was necessary. The German, once they lost part of their command, they sort of fell apart. They couldn't put it together as a fighting unit.
Now, did you guys fight any Italians, Hungarians? You know, any of the
No, we never felt any. The only troops that I ever remember fighting strictly were German troops, and some of them I think might have been brought in from other countries or whatever. But they were, I honestly think in Normandy, they didn't have their top shelf military fighting men, and we didn't have the kind of opposition that we thought we were going to run into with some of those groups.
How effective did you view their weapons compared to the American ones? I mean, how did you view the various?
You're asking me about how effective their weapons compared to ours?
How effective were their weapons? Did you think they were?
Well, the German weapons, they appeared to be and whatever, but I think we all felt when we got to know them and knew about them that our weapons were superior to theirs. We honestly felt that our M1 rifle would fire faster and further. Our little carbine wasn't the Spitfire that the Germans had, but it was very accurate and did a good job, easy to handle. And I felt that our weapons were basically adequate for what we were going to run into. I felt that our hand grenades were better than what they had. And it was just a case that, and of course maybe this is the mindset of an American soldier. We have the best and we can do better.
Now, did your opinion of the Germans change as the war went on, as you fought them? Did you view them in a different light?
Well, it's, they were in a case of backing up and giving up. But the thoughts went through most of our troops at that particular time. It was a war on. With looking up and seeing 1,000 planes in an armada going over to destroy and bomb their country, what would be their mental attitude? Where is any opposition? You look up and 1,000 planes were going over to destroy their country with no opposition. It seemed unbelievable. And if you were a German troop, you would wonder, how long can this last, or what's going to happen? This is all wrong. But being and feeling that way and seeing it, if we were to attack that day, their fighting would be, vicious as they could possibly make it. It wasn't a case of their giving up. They were not giving up at that particular time that I can remember. The war had won, ready to be ended, when they started to just give up completely.
Mm-hmm. Now, as after occupation duty, did you view them any different?
Well, you're talking about occupation after the war had ended.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember, of course, we were in Birch's Garden the day the war ended, and there were thousands of troops in all directions in that general area. And there was never any misconduct on their part. They behaved as they'd been well trained, and they behaved that they had lost, and they would ask you, where do we go, or what can we do, and tell them they had to go home. That was the only thing that we knew about for them. And there was great concentrations of them, but there was never anything vicious about it once the war had ended. They had completely, I think many of them have been glad the war had ended, whether they won or lost, the war was over.
Now, going back a little bit, I'm jumping around here again, but did you capture any enemy prisoners?
Not that I remember capturing them, but I can remember one particular night up in Holland, one little German soldier, and he was not a young boy anymore. You know, of course, if he was 50, I'd consider him an old man. But I think maybe he had gotten into drinking, and he just managed to find where our outpost was and came in and told us he was tired of the war and wanted to surrender. And so we just notified the headquarters where we were, because we, at that particular time, we were operating up there in Holland with outposts. And there was sort of a general track between one outpost and the other. And this fellow managed to wander in the dead of night, and one of the boys that was on guard didn't end up shooting him before he surrendered. And he was very nervous and trying to explain to anybody that could understand him that as far as he was concerned, the war was over and he wanted to go home.
And now the prisoners were treated, how were they treated by U.S. forces?
Our treatment of any surrendering soldiers I think, was extremely well. But I do remember in the heat of D-Day +1 that I think some atrocities took place where German soldiers actually had surrendered, and they never made it to the prisoner of war camp. I think there was occasions of that, but I can't, it's only something that I think or I reflect on, that some atrocities might have taken place on our part of our men had done it, but I don't have any proof or any facts that I can back it up with. Now,
you have heard the Captain Spears story?
Yes.
Is that the one you're talking about, or, I mean, have
no,
you heard...
the Captain Spears story, and I don't know how true that original story is, that he offered some German soldiers, this was on D-Day, some cigarettes and let them light up and enjoy an American cigarette, and ended up shooting them. Whether Captain Spears did that or not, I do not know. But I know as an absolute fact that he and one of our own boys had gotten into an argument, and I don't know whether it was because this young fella had gotten into one of the cellars over there in Normandy with a lot of wine and something to drink, became abusive with his language, was making a lot of noise, and the story, the way I understand it, Captain Spears warned them to be quiet, and we were close to the German troops, and the part of the story was that this fellow had raised his gun, and that is when Lieutenant Spears shot him.
Okay. Did you help?
Part of that story, I don't know whether you wanted, I think I've told it to you, but part of that story was that Lieutenant Spears went to his company commander, which was Captain Gross of D Company, and told them that I had just killed one of our men, and I don't know how much more of the conversation went on, but Captain Gross said, go back to your men, which Lieutenant Spears didn't think that was going to happen. Usually you're transferred right out, and Captain Gross that day himself was killed, and as far as I know, no charges were ever filed.
Okay. Did you help liberate enemy prisoner camps or concentration camps?
The only concentration camp that we hit, and oh, what a horror, you know, and this was, and I can't think of the name of it, it was on our way when the war was winding down. I think it was probably no more than a week or so before the war ended, and we got to Birch's Garden. But I think it was part of our battalion men that had found this camp. We were on a regular automotive or big trucks taking us, heading for Birch's Garden. And on one of our stops and staying overnight, some of our men discovered this prisoner of war camp. And as I understand it, it was an absolute horror. And I remember seeing them bringing men out of that camp that were emaciated, not dead, and they were trying to get them to hospitalization and where they could get some sort of care for them. Others were hanging on to the railings on the trucks, and terrible emaciated bodies. And I think in part of something that's been declared as history, Major Winters, after seeing it and being into that camp, he said now he understood why we went to war. And another story, I guess Colonel Sink went to the local village and made the villagers come back and with picks and shovels and buried the dead that were in the camp. And I never witnessed it. I never got into the camp. And our officers of our battalion at that particular time didn't want us all running and trying to get into the camp to just witness and see what was there. It was there, and leave it alone.
Yeah. Some guys were talking last night. They said you liberated an SS camp in Holland. Was that you, or was that somebody else? Am I mistaken?
It had to be somebody else.
Okay.
I had no part of that one. Not like that's the first I've ever heard of it.
Okay. How did you react, and how did your unit react to VE Day?
Well, VE Day was something, oh boy. We've waited for this, and we weren't sure when it would ever happen, and it was just absolutely marvelous that that the war had ended. And I remember here Churchill proclaimed that, we had unconditional surrender, the war was over. And at that particular time, or in Birch's Garden, prior to this day, our troops had located a big building that was full of some of the finest liquors and liqueurs that they had in Europe, that the Germans had confiscated and brought to this headquarters, which was Birch's Garden. And so one of our commanders or whatever had, I guess, declared if they wanted to load any of this into their vehicles and take them and distribute it among the men. And they came to the house that I was living at that time, and we helped ourselves to champagne and some wine, and I don't know if there was anything heavier than that, but we took more than our share of what we needed. There were about 10 of us living in that house, and I myself can remember after hearing the war had ended, unconditionally, the war is over, I remember popping the cork on a bottle of champagne and taking a nice swallow of it, several swallows, and then taking that bottle of champagne and throwing it out the window in that house. I never opened the window. And that was one of two things that I did during the war that I never was very proud of. There was no necessity for throw a bottle of champagne through a glass window in a lovely home that we were in. But this was the moment of the day and the exhilaration that was taking place.
Do you mind me asking about the second one?
No,
Okay.
No, the second one was just prior to getting into Birch's Garden. We'd go as far as we could for the day, and then we'd stop, and we'd take over that town or a house, and we're only going to be here overnight and be ready in the morning, men. And I can remember getting into this nice home and being in there, and many men in the group. I was never one of them. I was not a sweet lily of any sort, but I never believed in the looting that took place. And some of these men had to go through every drawer and every corner to see what they could find or anything they could put in their musette bag. And in the course of going through and one of the fellows said, "Come on, Falvey, I want to show you what's upstairs." And we got to the up in the attic, and this was 1 or 2 days after seeing the concentration camp when I run towards Noche's Garden. And there were all these, why can the word come to me right now? What kind of food did they send over there for the Red Cross packages?
Oh, okay.
And these were Red Cross packages that had been sent over to help the people that were in these camps and all to survive, and the Germans were supposed to give it to them, and our country had sent them over for that purpose. And that attic was quite loaded with the packages that had been sent over for the men that were in the concentration camps. And after seeing it and whatever, and this is a thought that I think I might have had, anyway, I'll take blame for it. And in this attic they had piles of little kindling wood that they put aside from the winter time if they wanted to fix or make their fire a little better, and their fire that they had in their hearth was in a neat pile. And so I took some of the rows off the top of that pile of wood, and I put a phosphorus grenade in that pile, and then put the wood back on again. So someday, when I had the pin pulled on it, so it was active, and it had to be some days, whatever, when they were getting wood for their hearth fire, that phosphorus grenade went off and probably destroyed their home. And that was one of the 2 things that I did that I've never been proud of.
Now, what were your proudest moments during the war? I mean,
oh dear. The proudest moments, of course, and when you ask that, and that's almost like asking me, what was the worst days that I had in the war?
I have to ask both sides of the spectrum, to make it balance out.
Well, the thing is that the worst days and whatever of the war and whatever, all I could think of was I was away from home. I just wanted to be home. Home was always in my head and in my heart, and that's the way I can look back at that war, just being away from home. Now, what was the other part of it?
That's all right. I'm
that
asking
pretty much covers
if you
it.
have the really bad days and the
Yeah.
things you're not proud of. What's on the opposite spectrum? What were you proud of accomplishing in the war? What were the good days?
The fact of being homesick or lonely for home, and being in this miserable physical condition. The other was we've been successful today. We can relax tonight and maybe close our eyes and not worry that everything is going to be good today. We've made enough advance that we don't have to worry about it. But just the attitude of the feeling that all the anxiety that goes with what can happen or being alert is relieved. You're back to being yourself again. But that being away from home is what killed me.
Now
you get lots of different reactions to that, but that's me.
Makes perfect sense. What were your reactions to Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day?
Well, that was, of course, the VJ Day. That was after they dropped the atom bombs. We were completely, this sets us free because we felt that the 101st was destined to make it to Japan if this war didn't end. And those atom bombs, pretty much in our mind, had ended the war and saved thousands and thousands of American lives by ending it the way it did. It was a horrible thing that took place. There can be lots of controversy between people as to what was right and what was wrong. It ended the war, and it was a plus side, I'd feel, for Americans.
So almost 70 years later, you've kept pretty much the same opinion?
Same opinion, same opinion. I just feel that it's something that had to be done, should be done, and if we had developed it, who knows how many months, weeks, or days later, the Japanese or the Germans back then, when they were capable of doing something like that, wouldn't have completely put it together and used it,
Mhm.
and they would have used it with no compassion whatsoever.